Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joseph Ryder Anderson podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a current tier list for the Union Arena metagame. The point of this tier list that we're going to be talking about today is to go beyond just the top tier decks that you hear about and see performing well at tournaments, and to really focus on a broader, more holistic picture of what is performing well and what you can take to your tournament. I think that one interesting thing about Union Arena that really draws me to it, and I'm sure it draws a lot of other people, is just the wide range of decks that are relatively competitively viable. So Union Arena is a game where you definitely have your top tier meta decks, but you can very easily go and win, or relatively easy, go and win a tournament without having to play a specifically meta deck. And even within the top decks, there's a lot of variation in how people play and build their decks. So with that being said, and in that spirit, let's take a look at the top three tiers of Union Arena decks. The top tier are your top most competitive decks, and even within that top tier, there's kind of a pretty stark contrast between the top guys and the lower guys, but still, tier 1 are the decks that are just really going to be the most commonly seen at tournaments and are going to be the ones that are most easy to win with. I think that's another thing about meta decks, is that the reason, part of why they're meta decks, is that they can do well without as much effort. So they're a little easier to pilot typically, so they get picked up and become popular. With that being said, some of the other decks that on the tier 2, these decks are going to probably be a little less effective overall in terms of win rates, but with the right skilled pilot, they can certainly take down a tournament and compete with the current meta. And then tier 3 are going to be your decks that are not quite as competitively viable, but are still decks that you can feasibly win with as long as you have the right scenario and the right matchups. They're going to be a little bit more situational and be a little bit more of a risk or a gamble, and have a little bit more of probably lower win rates as a result of that. So starting with the top tier, so we're going to be looking at Blue JJK. So Blue JJK is a deck that really comes with two distinct variants, and it's hard to say which one is better. My personal opinion is the better of the two, especially in the current meta, is the Blue JJK Nanami build. So the other Blue JJK focuses purely on Sukuna and Itadori as well. But that build is the advantage of that build is that if you can get it cooking and get all your fingers in your discard, you can build up to Sukuna, who gets, if you power him up with Melvin Shrine, becomes arguably the strongest character in the game. The thing is that it is a little bit of a higher risk, higher reward strategy. I like the Nanami build because it's a little more mid-range. It's a little less reliant on getting the fingers in the sideline, because Nanami has some pretty cool effects with it. I also like that Nanami has that resting effect, which is really good in a meta like the one we're in now, with Yellow Saitama being played pretty heavily. That gives you a tool to use against Yellow Saitama. If your opponent's attacking, you can switch the Saitama to resting, especially if there's like two Saitama, you can actually stop him, whereas you can't really do anything else against Saitama. So I like Blue JJK Nanami. I like its matchup spread overall, but pure Sukuna is obviously a really solid pick as well. So I would put on the tier 1 top deck is probably either Blue JJK Nanami or Blue JJK Sukuna. I would say Nanami is probably number 1, and then Sukuna is probably tied at number 2 with the next deck we're going to talk about, which is Purple Code Geass. Purple Code Geass really took Union Arena by storm when it came out, and for a while was kind of the undisputed top deck. It's still a really solid option. I think you could make the argument it's top deck. I just think that Blue JJK with Nanami especially has a few advantages in the current meta that Purple Code Geass doesn't have. But Purple Code Geass is just a killer deck. It has a lot of different tools. It's a little bit of a harder deck to pilot because of it's not something where you just have primarily 4 energy characters. You have to build up to 5 energy. You have to really manage your energy line to do well, and there's a lot of BP reduction effects that you have to pay attention to how you're using them. So Purple Code Geass is probably, of the top tier decks, Purple Code Geass is the hardest to pilot, which also makes it very rewarding and fun. And there's a lot of different ways to build Purple Code Geass. You can lean heavier into the Gurren play, using things like the 3-cost call and search that lets you find Gurrens from top of your deck. You can also lean into that with the checkmate card to get double impact off of that Gurren Force block. I think the reason to me personally why it's a little lower right now in the meta is that Yellow Saitama is definitely a top tier deck and it shows up a lot at tournaments. And Purple Code Geass has a little bit of trouble with Saitama because that 10k Saitama, if they manage to stand him, which they often do, can nullify your Gurren Force block if they are smart. So that's the only reason I think it's a little lower. Is that Gurren, before this, that Gurren Force block was kind of universally powerful. And if you ran into a situation where you're facing down 5Ks, you could just lower the 5K via one of your many BP reduction effects. Whereas in the current meta, BP reduction is just not as strong because it doesn't do anything against Yellow Saitama. So Yellow Saitama, even though it didn't end up like blowing away the meta, definitely made itself felt in the meta and how you play and how you counter other decks. So still, Purple Code Geass, super strong, really, really good draw triggers in this deck. You draw a lot of cards. You can easily get to low numbers. You can even get to just 4 non-triggers very easily in your deck if you want to. With the main weakness being it is reliant on having a consistent energy line, which makes it a little harder to just all-out rush with this deck. So that's Blue JJK also has less trouble with that. It doesn't need to build up to 5 as much. So there are sometimes you do want to hit that 5 number for that one Sukuna, but for the most part, you can get away with having a lower energy line, which makes rush plays a little easier. You're not always going to get the rush play with Code Geass. So that can also be a problem against Yellow Saitama, where Yellow Saitama's main weakness is against rush decks. So if you don't hit that, it can be a little tougher to deal with some of these decks. So overall, really solid deck. Certainly good enough to win you a tournament and one of the best decks right now in Union Arena. Moving on to what I feel is probably number 3 or 4, because Blue JJK Nanami and Blue Sukuna are different. So, but the next deck is going to be Yellow Saitama, and I think that Yellow Saitama is even better than what people realize. It really is a strong deck and really does change the way you play the game. You can't just rely anymore solely on removing cards, and decks that have some other thing in them to stop attackers and stop other decks, like the Nanami, for example, are going to become a little more effective. So that Yellow Saitama, if they manage to get 2 of their 5-cost 2 AP Saitamas onto the board, it's extremely hard to deal with this deck. This deck's main weakness is against that rush play. It does not have a very strong board presence. If they're using that 3-cost Saitama to push up, he moves back to the energy line. Saitama rests. There are ways to unrest Saitama, but you're just not going to get that reliably all the time. So what ends up happening is you have a relatively weak board presence, but a really strong offensive presence. So it can make that means if your opponent is smart and gets ahead early, even if you manage to get your plays off, they can still sneak out a win by getting that early rush play. So you're going to have the most trouble against decks that can easily build up a rush play like Yellow Tanjiro. But decks like Purple Code Geass, it's going to be a little bit harder because you can't reliably always get a rush play off with Purple Code Geass, right? So Yellow Saitama, super solid deck. Again, another deck that there's a lot of different ways to build this. I think the most popular one right now is pairing it with that the Hellish Blizzard card. So Hellish Blizzard can do a lot of cool things, and even on her own with Terrible Tornadoes, she's a decent deck. Not the top tier, but she's still a pretty strong deck. But you can use her within your Yellow Saitama deck to bring back lots of powerful event cards, especially your final. So I was just playing a tournament with a friend who was playing this, and despite me having a really strong start, he was able to come back using 2 final triggers in a turn, and then using his Hellish Blizzard to bring back a final trigger. So her one weakness is that she's only a 3000 BP character most of the time, which makes her relatively easy to get rid of, and definitely a prime target to get rid of. So you can shut off that bringing event cards back. But that is probably the most popular way of building out Saitama right now, as well as pairing it with the Genos, sorry. And that Genos, again, same battle. I lost again. I lost playing Purple Code Geass, even though I definitely had the winning move. I forgot about the Genos' win sideline, play a card, play another Genos from your hand. So that's something to keep in mind, is that Genos does have that win sidelined effect that lets your opponent play another Genos if it's removed. So that can make or break the game. Very, very important to pay attention to that effect. Moving on to the next deck on the list is Green Code Geass. So this would be number 5. So this is the Lancelot deck. Lancelot is still really strong. It's not that top echelon of the top decks, but it's right beneath. Very strong deck. Still seeing a lot of success at tournaments, and it can just be really, really strong if you know what you're doing with it. I think the only reason it's a little bit off the top is that it's not a deck that it's not as situationally effective. It's just a deck that you kind of play the same for the most part every time. And whether or not you're going to win is highly dependent on just whether or not you hit your energy line curve. You're not really going to be rushing early with this deck. You're not going to be playing it very differently every time you play. You're largely just trying to hit that energy curve so you can start playing your 6-cost Lancelots and then build up to your air cavalry. I think one innovation that's happened in this deck since it came out is people realize that the 6-cost Lancelot can be played raidless really well. So if you remember the way that people played Purple Bleach, where they would just pop down the Renjis and then use his damage too, Lancelot works that way, but he's even better because he has the damage too without having to pay an AP. So this deck really solid. There's different ways of building it. People like to tech in that Siegfried, I think is the name of that card, which brings back one of your Lancelots basically from your discard. I am not as big a fan of that. I like to play just pure Lancelot, and I think that works really well. But yeah, it's a very strong deck, and especially a deck if you like to just play a deck where you don't have to think a lot and do something different every time. It's a good deck to just play through your lines, and its pilot's largely the same every time. So next up we have Purple Bleach. Purple Bleach was once in the contention for top deck. But it has fallen off a little bit. It's still super strong and easily can win a tournament. I think the only main weakness it has is that it's just not as effective in a deck in a meta where Yellow Saitama. Again, I think Yellow Saitama is really what pushed Purple Bleach down, because Purple Bleach excels at just removing. But all of a sudden, if you're going up against Yellow Saitama, your cards become way less effective because you just can't remove him. So in that situation, if you're leaning more into a rush build, is probably what I would suggest. I used to play Purple Bleach a lot with Byakuya, but I think in the current meta, Byakuya is less relevant, whereas a more rush style Purple Bleach is the way to go. And just really look for that early game rush play, so that the fact you can't remove the Saitama in that particular matchup doesn't really matter as much. Purple Bleach has a slight disadvantage to the blue JJK decks, especially the Nanami build, because they are able to send cards to the bottom of your deck, not to your sideline, which hurts with fueling the sideline. So it's not as effective against blue JJK. It does fine against Purple Code Geass, no problem there. It does fine against the other deck, which we haven't talked about yet, which is Yellow Tanjiro, and then it can do well against Lancelot, with the only disadvantage being those 5k characters not being able to swing through those. So it's just it's a solid deck. It's just a little bit disadvantaged in the current meta. So hopefully when the next Bleach Volume 2 comes out, we get some cards that help improve its standing in the meta a little bit. Then moving on to the final deck in the top tier, which is Yellow Tanjiro. I would say Yellow Tanjiro, despite it being in the top tier, is probably the weakest of the top tier decks. Its main advantage is it lets you get off multiple attacks in a turn, and that's something that none of the other top tier decks excels at. So this deck definitely does it the best of any deck in the meta, even better in the game right now, and it does it even better than Speed of Sound Sonic with its switching effects. But Yellow Tanjiro's strength really lies in the ability to use Nezuko to switch your Tanjiro out and switch another attacker in. This not only does this help you offensively, it also acts as a very strong defensive measure to protect your strong Tanjiro, especially that Tanjiro with the permanent impact. You can just keep using impact attacks over and over. So a lot of people play this deck super low to the ground, super rushy, a lot of 0-cost characters, and I think that is the best way to play this. You want to lean into that super hyper rush style play, and that's going to be this deck's strongest advantage, and you can use it very effectively against a Yellow Saitama. I think another strong tech would be the Tokito, I think is his name. He's that 5-cost Hashira that freezes. I think it's a really powerful tool in the current meta to just sort of shut down your opponent. So definitely look to Yellow Tanjiro. It's a very popular deck as well. I was just watching a video from Cosmic where he was talking about or he showed a slide where Tanjiro was like one of the top singles sold in the Q1 of this year. So definitely this is not just in Union Arena, but of any game. So super popular deck. I think what's really interesting is to move on beyond the decks that are typically talked about as the top tier decks. Let's look at some of the tier 2 decks. Let's start with what I think is probably the number 1 tier 2, which is Kurapika. I don't think Kurapika's tier 1 anymore. I think its place got taken largely by Lancelot. I think if you're gonna play a high energy cost green deck like that, you're gonna want to go with Lancelot. Typically, it's easier to play and it's just a bit more reliable, and has like that raidless play, which helps it a lot. Kurapika doesn't really do anything raidless, so I think that's a huge advantage Lancelot has. But it's still a strong deck. It can still take down a tournament if you know what you're doing. One of my friends that I play with is super solid with this deck, and he can easily beat any of the top tier decks right now. So Kurapika is super solid. It just hasn't aged quite as well. I don't think it's aged quite as well even as Bleach Purple, but it's still a really solid deck. Number 2, we have the Psychic Sisters. So I was not certain of how this deck would fare when it first came out. I think it's still a little overhyped. It's not a top tier deck in my opinion, but it's a solid tier 2 and super competitive in the current meta. I think it has some really good matchups, some really bad matchups, and that's what largely pushes it off of that top tier. But you certainly have a lot of plays and a lot of ways to extend your turn via Hellish Blizzard and things like that. And it's one of those decks where if you get it rolling, you can really just steamroll your opponent. But there's just a lot of weaknesses, especially against rush style plays and things like that, that can make this deck a little less effective at the top level. Just below that, I think Metal Bat is a really solid option too. It's kind of like an upgraded Toshiro Rush, where it has a very same style as play. You really want to lean into that early game rush style, and then you have some pretty decent removal later on via Atomic Samurai especially, where you can just pop that Atomic Samurai down and remove a 4K character. And it does also have the Flashy Flash, which is just a super strong finisher, assuming you have enough characters on the field. That Flashy Flash is really strong. And I do love the fact that Metal Bat has a Nullify impact outside of the raid box, making him super effective to just play raidless, as well as having the raid, which gives him impact. So he's one of the stronger characters right now with that Nullify, 4,000 BP characters with that Nullify impact outside of the raid box. So Metal Bat, super solid. I don't see Metal Bat being as effective as time goes on. I think it fares well in the meta currently, but I think probably a few sets down the road, Metal Bat will just kind of get edged out by decks that can do a little bit more. But right now, Metal Bat is definitely a contender and a solid tier 2 pick. Beyond that, we have Ashford Academy. Ashford Academy is just super aggro. If you don't know about it, it's from Code Geass. Super aggro-y deck. And if you don't know what you're doing against it, you haven't played against it before, you can easily get surprised by how many attacks it can get off, especially via its strongest character, which is Suzaku, the 4-cost Suzaku, who can attack, has impact, and then can restand a character who's rested, switch them to active, and then keep getting more attacks off. So if you haven't played against Ashford before, you might be in for a little bit of a shock. But if you have played against it enough, you kind of get the idea of how to keep pace with it. And it's not like unbeatable, but yeah, can definitely sneak in a lot of attacks and can do really well against some of those more control-focused decks like Yellow Saitama or the Lancelot deck. Beyond Ashford Academy, we have Toshiro Hitsugaya. Again, I just mentioned Metal Bat's like a more current version of this deck, but Toshiro still has a lot to be said for it, especially since Toshiro can rest characters. This is a great counter to Yellow Saitama. So if you're playing in a Saitama heavy format, Toshiro can be really, really solid to basically act as like a baby removal against that Saitama, freezing him. He can't restand, totally takes him out of the game for a while. And then you still have plenty of removal via Kenpachi. You can switch that Kenpachi to active via Yoruichi, I think is her name. So this deck has a lot of tools, and people are also bringing back Yamamoto. I've been seeing Yamamoto show up in locals and doing fairly decently, which is interesting to see. But it's definitely not top tier anymore, but it was at one point top tier, and it can be very competitive and definitely sneak out some wins. I think the only reason why it's not higher up is that there's just other decks that can do what it does a little better. But in terms of like against a broader range of matchups, but against certain matchups, it can be really killer, especially against like Yellow Saitama. It's super strong. Garou is a deck that I thought was not as strong as it actually can be, and it's been showing up and doing pretty well at tournaments. And Garou again has that sort of late game play that you're working towards, where you're stacking up cards in your sideline to give Garou just some pretty crazy strength. He becomes 4,500 BP. He can has impact, and if he's not blocked, he gets to attack again. So Garou is really strong. There's also some added removal in this deck that makes it just a very effective deck. I think its main weakness and why it's again tier 2 is that you're just not always going to hit all those cards in your sideline before your opponent basically takes you out. So a really solid attacker, a really solid deck. It's just a little less reliable to keep it from being in that top tier. Because it's essentially because it's a little less reliable, you're gonna have some suffered win rates, right? Like you're not gonna win as frequently with Garou as you would with another top tier deck. And then beyond that, we have yellow JJK. So primarily, I'm thinking here of the Panda deck, which is pretty solid, just a really solid, well-rounded deck. But there also is that Megumi deck, which is pretty solid too, and you'll see this showing up at tournaments. Moving on to the tier 3, I still think these decks are worth mentioning because they can do well. They just require a bit more luck, and they require just some decent matchups. Your win rate's going to be lower with these than the other two tiers, and I wouldn't say these are like as competitive, but you can definitely still play them. They're still playable. That's kind of why I included them. You want to, if you want to play it because you like the mechanic and you don't mind that the win rate's a little lower, you can certainly play these decks competitively. And I'm going to start out with Gyutaro Daki. If you follow my content or even just follow me on social, I talk a lot about this deck because this is my favorite deck from the Demon Slayer set, and it's the one I always play at Demon Slayer Rare Battles. And this deck is just really fun to play and only is missing a few pieces to be really strong. But it's I love the interplay between cards. I love that Gyutaro raid. I love the Daki raid. I love the whole thing. I love that you can build up to Akaza and take out some characters with Snipe. It's just a really fun deck and really solid. It's just missing some removal, some strong removal to make it fair against the better decks. But if you hit your cards right, you can definitely take down a tournament. I have done so with Gyutaro Daki, so I would start with that one at number 1. Number 2, we have Speed of Sound Sonic. This deck has not fared as well as I would have thought it would. I kind of thought this would be more of like that tier 2 deck, but it's definitely has some weaknesses. I think you to play this deck well, you really want to lean into that removing your own card from life mechanic, which is fun, but it's also just ends up coming back to bite you a bit, because as you're removing your own life to use like those Boros effects and things like that, you end up weakening yourself against your opponent. And the other thing too about this deck is that it doesn't fare well against Yellow Saitama, so that's a top tier deck that you're going to have an innate disadvantage against, despite the fact that you can beat it. I've beaten it several times, but Saitama essentially shuts off Speed of Sound Sonic switching, which it's like, okay, well, if there's a deck in the top tier that can shut off your switching attack and that's your strongest play, why not just go with Yellow Tanjiro, where Yellow Tanjiro's switching effect doesn't get shut off, right? So if you're going to play a deck of this style, Yellow Tanjiro is just better, so that kind of bumps it down a bit. Yeah, but still solid. Still a solid deck to play. I think it can fare. I've beaten top tier meta decks with this, so it just depends on getting pretty lucky. I think it's just a higher luck factor to make this contend. Like you just really have to line everything out just right. Like for example, the tournament that I won where I was playing again, I beat a Sukuna. The only reason I beat the Sukuna is because I got ahead early and was able to get to that exact 4 prize total. But it's just, you're just not always going to hit that. Like that's in a perfect game, Speed of Sound Sonic works well, but it just has trouble adjusting in a less than perfect game. And speaking of decks that are like that, Green Saitama, I just got pulverized by Green Saitama in a tournament, but that was because my opponent hit exactly what they needed at exactly the right time. And if you can do that, Green Saitama can just completely destroy your opponent. But again, you have to do that. It's not a deck that can handle really getting behind super well, or a deck that can handle things not going exactly right. It's also a deck that you kind of play the same every time, which makes it a little less fun for players who like more of a challenge. But Green Saitama, people largely talked about this deck like it was going to break the game, and it did not end up doing that. It's not largely played competitively as much anymore. But it is a deck that under the right circumstances can just blow you away. And being on the delivering side of that one punch win feels really good, and being on the receiving end of that one punch kill shot feels really bad. So it's a kind of a little bit of a polarizing deck there. Moving on to Pizza is a deck that I personally love. I love the Pizza deck. It's the red Pizza deck from Code Geass. I did win a rare battle early on with Code Geass before people really knew how to play Code Geass very well with Pizza. And I built it like a kind of a hybrid Pizza Ashford deck. But Pizza is really fun and can be really, really strong. And at the time it came out, I think was actually higher up in the tier, was probably just off of the top tier. Because it could be really effective. I think as time has gone by, there's just other decks that can do what it does almost as well. Like for example, Garou kind of ends up being a lot like Pizza, but can just do a little more effectively. But Pizza is really heavily reliant on you getting those 6 Pizza cards in your sideline. And if you hit those early, you can just demolish your opponent. But if you don't hit those at all, you kind of suffer, even with the Ashford play early on. So, and then last in the tier 3 is the yellow Hashira, which is a deck that far exceeded my expectations. And if it had a raid in it available that fit in well with the Hashira strategy, Hashira would probably be in itself a top tier deck, or at least tier 2, high up on tier 2. But Hashira does really, really well if you can build up a lot of characters on your board. You get a lot of interplay between characters. You get removal. You get double attacks. You get a lot, but Hashira does not have a single raid option in its deck. And I think that if it did, it would be a lot stronger. So, but Hashira is definitely something that you can win a tournament with. You just have to get all of your pieces on the board. So that's the main problem. If you suffer a lot of removal, it's hard to come back because it's a deck that really needs to build momentum, like a lot of other decks out there. So that's my sort of all of the decks in the competitive range right now. I'm sorry if I'm forgetting anybody, but I will add this list to the episode notes for this show, the show episode, and hopefully you found that helpful and helped you think a little outside the box in terms of what to bring to your next Union Arena store tournament. Until next time, thanks for listening.